Our first guest is based in New York. She worked as a social worker, case manager, counselor. She's a quintessentially loving mother of 2 girls and an experienced leadership trainer. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rhiannon Galen-Personick. Our next guest likes to scare people. Has a daughter who is a quintessentially loving mother of 2 girls, author of several groundbreaking books in the Agile field, for 10 years now host of the Metacast, and is a wonderful and compassionate Agile coach. Please welcome Bob Galen.
And our natural reaction as human beings is to become immediately defensive or shut down. It's like that fight, flight, or freeze mode that happens in our brains. And that's exactly what was happening. And it wasn't just for, I got to own it, it wasn't just my dad, but because I was having the conversation with my dad, I was ready to poke the bear. And at one point we had to realize I had to stop poking the bear. I don't know if you remember it that way.
I do remember. The other part of this is it's not something it was my awareness wasn't there. It wasn't something I was not doing or doing. It was I was clueless, if that makes sense to everyone. I really wasn't aware of this notion of privilege. And therefore being more aware of it, self-aware of it, then I could potentially I could play a part in widening my awareness and taking other actions that I normally wouldn't do with the core constituency. Like Rhiannon said, did you reach out to people specifically? And I'm like, no, that's not my job. But if I'm really looking for a diverse class and I understand the notion of privilege, then I may need to take that action if I want to get that. It just doesn't naturally come. So this is our genesis story. And I'm still, and the point here is I fully don't understand all aspects of privilege, but what I'm now starting to do is to really try to increase my awareness of diversity and broaden my lens, if you will. And that's what we're here to just talk about, just a little bit, slightly broaden the lens. Now, I think there's a Harvard Business Review article that talks about, and I want everyone who's listening in to sort of bring this into your heart, because this is truth. We lack, I think generally many of us lack self-awareness. We're not even self-aware that we are unself-aware. I don't know if that makes sense, but 95% of the people think they're self-aware. They did a survey. So almost everyone thinks they're self-aware. But when they did 360-degree surveys and tested the self-awareness, only 10 to 15% of the folks were actually verified to be self-aware. I don't care about those numbers. What I care about is it shows that there's a large gap out there in the world. So out of every 10 little windows in Zoom that I can see, 8 of you, don't feel picked on. I'm not identifying the 8, but 8 of you lack self-awareness to some degree. And so the question is, how do we start expanding on that? And how do we cultivate that? And we're going to focus in on that today from a diversity point of view. The tool we're going to use is, and I'll just hit the button and advance it, is something called the Johari window. And we're going to use it for discovery and discovering diversity self-awareness. We're going to narrow it in to just think about diversity concepts and diversity tactics and go into that. The first area is what's known to others and known to you. It's referred to as the open space or the arena. Rhiannon, the next one?
The next one is what's known to others but not known to ourselves, so blind spots. For example, my whiteness was not something I was aware of right away, but clearly the people of color that I have worked with were very aware of my whiteness and what that privilege looked like. It took a long time, even in my journey as a social worker, predominantly working in communities of color, to kind of be aware of what my whiteness was to me.
If you recall that Genesis story, I had a privileged blind spot. And initially I reacted defensively because I was blind to it. I'm like, what the heck are you talking about? That's not a problem for me. But then I started scratching the surface and I started moving it. Rhiannon, you want to take that one as well?
Yeah, something that's not known to others, but you know yourself. I'll just give a very personal example of this. It was actually something that started in my blind spot, moved into my hidden facade, and then the open area. I have two beautiful children. I love that my dad included that in there, and they mean the world to me. But when my partner and I were trying to have a second child, I realized that I had fertility problems. And so it was a blind spot to me. And it was such a huge, like eye-opening, really shameful moment in my life that I realized I didn't need to be shameful about, but it started out feeling shameful about who I was as a woman and the idea that I couldn't conceive a child. Even though I had already had a child, it still felt very painful. So it really kind of stayed in that hidden facade until I realized that I didn't have to feel shameful anymore. And I really worked to make it open and be able to talk with my peers and my friends to really kind of own that you don't have to be shameful about that.
And the final one is the unknown unknowns. It's that area that we're trying to just, sort of it's out there and we're trying to reduce it. Very often just introspection sort of scratches at the surface. Or if you get coached, for example, if you go out and get external coaching, they can help you sort of uncover your blind spots, but also uncover those unknowns that are affecting you, your self-awareness. So if you think about it, we want to acquire feedback for our blind spots. We want to disclose to reduce the hidden facade. And we want to get coaching, not so much counseling, but just coaching or peer mentoring to become more aware of the unknowns. And if you think about it, we just want to be opening the arena a little bit, if everyone's with me. So the strategy with the Jahari window is awareness, just discovery and awareness, self-reflection, and then opening that up. And there's no direction. You can open up, you can reduce blind spots, but you really want to take the blind spots and the unknowns and get more awareness there. And then the hidden facade is really your choice. If you feel safe, typically you'll disclose more. Everyone with me? So dependent on safety, if you have low safety, you will disclose little. If you have higher safety, organizationally within your team, personal safety, then you can open that.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I do this a lot to my dad. One thing I just hit in my head about the unknown unknowns, and I think it's important to say this, is kind of our world reaction to COVID-19. It was such an unknown to all of us. And I actually heard some of that discussion before we started this. And it was such a beautiful discussion about how this unknown has started us owning our communication styles, right? It may have opened us up to the blind spots that we had. And some of us may have put some of that shame that we felt on our blind spots into the hidden facade. But the goal is that we really talk about this so that we can kind of really work on those and move it into that open arena area.
This is a nice place to pause. And if you have a pencil and paper handy or you want to get it, we're going to ask you later on to draw a matrix. Pretty easy, just 4 squares. And we're going to ask you to do some work on your own for a few minutes that hopefully we can inspire you to do later on and do some more personal reflection. So grab a pen and a piece of paper if you wouldn't mind. Not electronic, but actually physical paper and a physical writing instrument. So now we want to dive into some aspects of diversity to add to your Agile journey. It's not adding a skill, it's adding awareness, and awareness is a continuum. So don't get stuck. It's not binary. It's not, I am gender, I'm gender unaware and then I am gender aware or whatever. It's not that, so it's a journey process. But with that, my daughter's going to take it away for a while and do a little bit of a deep dive into aspects.
Yeah. So we do a lot of training in the social work field around diversity aspects, especially self-awareness. It's kind of like a 101 when you go through social work, because you realize that who you are can impact other people. So I'm going to highlight on the left-hand side, this beautiful person, right? The kind of things that impacted me as a person. So my specific diversity aspects. So a little bit of my Jahari window. I'll start with social class. One thing that my dad doesn't always talk about, and we have actually now started to talk about more together is how we grew up very poor. We really didn't have a lot growing up. I think my parents were in their, mid-20s by the time there were 4 kids in the house. There was a lot going on, a lot of kind of instability when it came to that. And I still to this day sometimes don't feel comfortable going into stores that seem very high class or very expensive, right? So those are things that kind of resonate with me. Sex and gender, and I'm going to separate these out a little bit. On the left-hand side, you can see SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity. Those are 2 different things. So sex is your biological sex, whether you're male, female, intersex, that kind of falls into that area. Where gender identity is, we really want to kind of expand that box of what that looks like. So for me, I'm a cisgender female. Cisgender meaning I identify with the sex that I was assigned at birth. There's also transgender, where you don't identify with the sex you were assigned at birth. There's gender fluid, there's gender non-binary, and that the umbrella term for that would also be gender queer. So there's kind of like this much broader perspective of what gender means to us. And for me, I was definitely not aware of my cis privilege. I was very aware of my sex as a female and what that meant out in the world and how I have to protect myself. I have 2 daughters, so I'm very aware of teaching my daughters how to protect themselves. They're 5 and 2. My 2-year-old knows that she has a vagina, right? That's one way to help her kind of protect herself and understand her body in a very safe way. Age was something that kind of impacted me. I may not look as young as I used to, but when I was first starting out in the field, I looked very young. And I'm going to connect this to parental parenting status. As a young 20-something-year-old trying to teach parents how to be appropriate with their children and safe with their children, but never having children, oh, that was bad. That was just not, I made so many mistakes, right? There's such a connection there, right? But me as a parent now, I definitely have a lot more empathy towards parents and what that means, right? But I also talked before about my journey about what it meant to become a parent. What I didn't say was very later in my life that I became a parent. I was a much older parent. So there was a status there that I kept trying to reach, not aware of how that was impacting me from a diversity aspect. Other things on here that we should always consider for other people are immigration status, ethnicity and nationality, language, right? When we first started, we were listening to German, which was absolutely beautiful. And then because there are people who speak English, we're switching to English. So language can be such an impact on our diversity and who we are and how we have to sometimes assimilate to the expectation that's placed on us. And race is so important, right? What does that mean? And how does that connect to us? We talked a lot about that with privilege, specifically whiteness. So looking at the other side, we've done a lot about privilege and what that means. But again, to expand this, I added cis privilege. There's also the idea of me as a heterosexual, there's hetero privilege, and what does that mean in a very hetero-focused society that we live in? And how do I have those conversations with people, right? Same thing with gender. I always encourage people to think about the person that they're connecting with and ask themselves, do I need to know what their gender is? How does that impact this conversation? Same thing with sexual orientation. What does that mean to me, and what's the reason I'm eager to know what that means based on the relationship I'm having with this person? Intersectionality is such an important topic to discuss. This is looking at all of these diversity aspects and kind of layering them on top of one person, right? So if you have someone who is a person of color, who is gay, who may be in poor health, who is an immigrant, all of those create an intersectionality of the weight that's on them. In my world, when I do trainings about this, I really try to steer people to understand that we can never take that weight from somebody. We can only help them and validate them that weight exists and help them figure out how to carry that weight. And one way we do that is by validating that they are who they are, and it's so important that we recognize all of that.
Rhiannon, is it fair to think of intersectionality as just a layered cake? Like it's layers. You're
Yeah.
peeling layers of an onion. So it's not just privilege. I am a white male, 60-something. I've grown up poor. Now the diversity, to understand me, I have diversity built into that intersectionality cake, if you will. I am becoming more and more unique as we look at that. Is that one of the important parts? So consider the layers. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. Like whenever you approach someone, again, it's not, I like the idea of considering the layers, but I'm very big in that validating that those layers exist so that person feels like they matter. And it's not just the fact that they're a person, it's the fact that they're more than just the person. They are a female, they are a gay female. What does that mean to them? And how do we connect with that person from all those levels? What kind of gets in the way is this idea of bias, a specifically implicit bias. We all have explicit biases that's where we're very aware of what we're biased towards. For example, I am very biased towards Starbucks, right? I have an obsession. It's a problem. I had to get Starbucks this morning. It's not okay right now. I was very happy when our local Starbucks reopened. Because it was a drive-through, thank goodness. However, I'm also very negatively biased towards Dunkin' Donuts, and my partner is obsessed with Dunkin' Donuts, and I feel so bad for him because we never go there anymore. Of kind of a very silly example of explicit bias, but we all have those that we can kind of own. It's the implicit biases that can get in the way, and these are really, they kind of start in the unknown and can lead into our blind spots, right? So what does it mean to have that implicit bias? And I'll give an example from my professional world. I never realized that I had this implicit bias towards females in leadership roles until I took the time to pay attention to my current relationship with my supervisor, who has been a social work leader for 20 plus years and is just so intelligent and so good at her job. And I've learned so much from her, but every time we would get together, it just felt so adversarial. And I was constantly throwing the blame on her, that there's a reason it was adversarial. And it was all her, of course. And I realized, taking the time to think about our interactions and what was going on, that I had this implicit bias that females could not be assertive, that if they were trying to be assertive, they were actually being aggressive, which we know is a bias, that when a woman comes off as strong and assertive, we have a tendency to think of them as aggressive. And that's exactly what I was doing. And that was my implicit bias that I really became aware of. And now I'm slowly working it into my open arena so that I can kind of move past that shame, because here I am as a female buying into this very negative stereotype of women, and I wasn't even aware of it. So that has actually honestly helped our relationship so much, just kind of taking that ownership and realizing that that was kind of happening for me. So.
There's a wonderful video that Rhiannon and I have watched several times. It's online. We didn't want to interrupt the talk today with it, but we'd encourage you to look it up offline. You can just Google it. It's called The Privilege Walk. And what it is, it's about a 4 or 5 minute video where you line up a group of people, and it's a canned set of 35 questions, and you line everyone up equally, and then the questions start teasing apart privilege, aspects of diversity. And at the end, you see where people are. And they actually start hand in hand or elbow in elbow, but then they get pulled apart depending on what's happening. And then you can see who's privileged and who's not. That's not the point. The point is really to see that distribution, it unfolds the diversity. The other thing you'll see in the videos is the people are happy at the beginning. They're sort of joking around and they're having fun, but in the end, and they do some interviews in the best video, I think, one of the videos, they interview the folks and they get very reflective, and they're not depressed or they don't have anxiety, but they're reflecting on, I didn't realize the differences. I didn't realize my negative privilege, if you will, or my positive privilege. I didn't realize the distribution. It's just uncovering. It's like that discovery or transparency. You uncover that, and then it generates thoughtfulness and awareness. And it's an interesting video to look at.
I noticed that, Elisa, thank you for posting that in the chat box, the video. It really is a wonderful opportunity to kind of connect for yourself, kind of how that feels. We've done that a lot within our organization, and it has absolutely helped people become more aware of things. And what's interesting is you see that we all have aspects of diversity that have impacted us, and we forget sometimes how that has impacted us, right? Again, that becomes a blind spot or a facade, and how do we start being more comfortable with it? So,
one thing to keep in the back of your mind, and it aligns with stereotyping, and this is an area where I'm really working on myself as well, because I have a tendency to stereotype a little bit. And I'm becoming more self-aware of it. And it's across all of those aspects. So I stereotype, but I'm really trying to come back to center. And there's this notion of, if you've met one, you've just met one. So if you've met one Black working mother, that doesn't give you a view. You do not know all Black working mothers. Everyone with me? We only know one. And then we need to meet, if we meet another Black working mother, we need to meet them where they are and discover that and explore that with them. If you've met one married gay man with children, you've met one. If you've met one Latino female back-end engineer expert in Scrum, you've met one. That's the intersectionality coming into play. Now, if you've met one American, you may have met more than just one. So we may have some stereotypical behavior. But again, there's that. If you've met one child with autism, one of the areas is in neurodiversity. A lot of folks will stereotype autism like it's like one thing. And you want to, if you've met one child with autism, you've met one child with autism. The next child that you meet, do not bring that view to them. Discover that, explore that, or see where that's at, or at least don't bring that mindset together to them.
One thing that, just to go back, one thing that kind of is important to acknowledge and validate is what gets in the way here, which is our worldviews and how those worldviews have been created. And a lot of that worldview is very thinking about it of like me as an individual and what has impacted me and my values and beliefs. That's my immediate family. But it's also my extended family and the community that I grew up in that kind of help infuse all those values and beliefs in terms of what it means to be X, Y, or Z. And then it goes even further than that, right? That's my macro world that I'm connected with. So the social media, news, how does that play a part into infusing some of those things? I can very clearly talk about American television. The way that we depict people of color is so stereotypical. The way that we depict the LGBTQ community is just, it's hysterically, in a negative way, stereotypical. But that's what's helped kind of define our values and beliefs into this idea that when we've met one, we've met them all. So I say that to validate, there's a lot of layers that we have to chip away at to become self-aware of where we stand in terms of what is the reality versus what is something that has kind of been drilled into me. And that's why it is very easy to have an unknown and blind spot area.
I wanted to bring it around to other aspects, so outside of core, and all we're trying to do is broaden your view. We're not trying to inundate you or frighten you or say, oh my gosh, I have this huge gap. You have a gap. But again, look at the layers. And I wanted to come back. I've seen diversity in technology or in Agile. So technical stacks. We have biases around what technology tool sets, experience levels. In some organizations, if you don't have 10 years or 20 years of experience, you're this. Or if you don't have a college degree or in a computer or a technology field, you're this. Agile, if you've only worked in Kanban, you can't work. We have biases against Scrum from the Kanban folks, or Kanban from the Scrum folks. I'm kidding around. Scaling frameworks, we can have biases with scaling frameworks, etc. Generational, and I've seen this come to play in many organizations when you're building your Agile teams, if that makes sense. Like these biases come into play. So there's technology biases. I once For 10 years, I didn't hire any engineer who did not have a computer engineering or computer science degree. That was just where I was. And then one day I happened upon a PhD music major who had some coding chops, but really was a musician, a jazz musician. And I hired him, and he was a wonderful addition to the teams. He exploded the team. It was just with new ideas and it added to the diversity. I once hired in another Agile team an ex-clown, and Douglas was wonderful. I'm like, and everyone's like, "What are you doing, Bob? You're out of your mind. You're going to hire a clown to write code?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I think it might be fun." And then he sort of touched his nose, and everyone was fine with it. No, I'm just kidding. But it comes in. There's other dimensions to it. The other thing that I see is there's a lot of we have sometimes Agile biases. Everyone, I'm not going to look at the screen, but just raise underneath the covers, raise your finger if you have a bias against leadership sometimes. If you've looked up and it said it's all their fault, right? or whatever. You don't have to show the finger. That's a bias, and that doesn't help us. That doesn't help us with our diversity. We want to meet to understand, seek to understand, rather than seek to categorize.
Yeah.
And so I've seen it with testers or SDETs. I've seen it with other teams competing, organizations, even biasing against yourself. I'm not good enough, or I don't have the right degrees, or I didn't grow up wealthy enough.
And this is where intersectionality can be really important to be aware of, right? Because it's not just a product owner, but it could be a female product owner. Do we have a bias against females? And because we also have a bias against product owners, what is that intersectionality that we could be putting off on them? Or that's me. I could be that female product owner. Am I aware of those things? Because that's also part of our Johari window. What am I aware of or not aware, but others may see it?
I see that, Rhiannon,
so that's
all
also
the time.
Part of that.
I see it all the time in my coaching. It's not a direct, it's not blinking, but I see diversity aspects. Just like you said, I've worked with female product owners, and the organization doesn't feel that they're decisive enough, or they're assertive enough, or they're too assertive. And it's really not about that. It's a lack of, we're not handling the diversity very well. We're not, and the organization isn't cognizant of that. They haven't explored that. They haven't conversed with that.
Mm-hmm.
So where I want to go, everyone, I'm going to, in an effort to be more transparent, I'm going to show you some notes I'm using the Johari window, and I'm jotting down some things that I think I'd like to expose to you all, even my known unknowns. So I'm taking liberties a little bit. But for me, Bob Galen, what is in my arena? I'm a white male. I'm an Agile coach, author, consultant. I'm a baby boomer. I'm a dog animal lover. I live in the US, in North Carolina. What are some things that I hide from people? Sometimes I don't disclose. I'm a grandfather. I feel like there's age discrimination at times, so I don't necessarily talk about my grandchildren, because now the white beard kind of gives me away, but still, I could be dyeing it white, so that it could be artificial to appear wise.
He's clearly not dyeing it white.
I'm a Christian. I went through a messy divorce. I grew up farming on a farm. I'm a farm boy. I grew up incredibly poor. I don't want to talk about it so much, but it's there. That's why I don't want to talk about it. I hardly talk about I'm an Army veteran. And what I don't talk about very often at all, probably professionally at all, is I have 2 bipolar children. If you know what bipolar is, it's manic depression. And that's been a part of our family for, their entire lives. What's not known to myself, and some of these things, but the fact that I'm 60 something, I'd like to think that I'm younger. So there's a lack of realization. Like in my mind, I think I'm 39. I don't know why I've triggered on 39, but I am 39 in my mind. And I don't want to know. I don't want to know about that right now. Anyone else? I trivialize diversity and I have a narrow view. That's getting better. I'm working on it. I used to ignore diversity. I would pretend I went to the classes offered in the workplace because you have to. But in my mind, I was really not. I thought I was super diverse, and it wasn't an issue for me. And now I'm starting to understand. clear understanding of other religions. And then I don't know if I know that I'm diet and exercise challenged, although maybe Peter has probably talked to me about that in the past. So, but there. And then some of the things at the bottom, these are things that unknowns, but Blackness in America is something that I'm trying to move into a work in progress with coaches, a deeper understanding, and you heard this in our Genesis story, of white and male privilege. I'm really trying to dig underneath that in general. Understanding of millennials, or I would say all generations, if that makes sense to everyone. I need to understand generational context. So we brought that in to our teams. Everyone with me, I'm disclosing that, and now I'm working on myself, and based on that, I can start opening my arena a little bit. Everyone with me, I can open it up. I don't have to do much. I just identify it. So the first step is self-awareness. It really is. So what I'd like you to do on this pieces of paper, we're gonna pause. I know we're almost done, so we have a little time. But I want to take 3 minutes, and I want you all. So what about you? I want you to increase your awareness, and I'd like you to put something in every quadrant. Everyone with me? Just start jotting down some crib notes for yourself. I just want you. So your lens is here. I want you to open your lens. Your lens is here. I want you to open your lens a little bit. So in fact, I'll do this properly. I have a 3-minute clock. Okay, everyone? You're on the clock. You have about 90 seconds. And since you're not going to, you don't have to show this to anyone, everyone put on courage. Really dig inside yourself and try to dig something up and put it there for reflection. Put on your courage and try to pull something out that you normally wouldn't talk about, or you don't face, or even put in a question in the unknown. Put a question in there. Oh, maybe I should consider this. I should figure this out. I don't know. Okay, that was the longest 3 minutes on the planet. So thank you all for, there it goes. I prematurely, you can hear it beeping. So we want to wrap things up. The last thought we want to leave you with is if we're going to change, so self-awareness, observation and reflection, and then if we want to start changing, I think there's an important aspect. And if we, Rhiannon and I talked, and we had to bring up Bruce Lee. We couldn't do this talk without bringing up Bruce Lee. I don't know what that means, but in order to change, and this goes back to change. Someone was talking about change before as we were listening in. They were talking about COVID and the change. Very often, if you want to change, you have to like throw away some things in order to relearn some things. If that makes sense to everyone, right? In order to become more diverse, you have to empty your cup a bit to fill your cup. And I think that's an incredibly important metaphor, because if we don't empty, and it's another way of saying that is put on the mind of a child. Be curious, empty your cup, and then discover and fill it with new things. And I know that sounds a little zen-like, but it's a really important concept.
Absolutely.
So with that, Rhiannon?
No, we really want to thank you for allowing us to be here and talk about a topic that can be uncomfortable and really start to encourage you to become comfortable. One of my social work heroes that many of you probably have heard of is Brene Brown. I'm not going to lie, I have a huge social work crush on her. She really does a beautiful job talking about vulnerability and shame and what that means. And the reality is the more vulnerable we are, the braver we are. I'm actually wearing a shirt today that says brave on it because I really wanted to be brave for this conversation. And I encourage you to be brave and own your vulnerability as you go through this journey. So thank you so much for allowing us to